Okay, well, welcome everyone. We have with us today Dr. Vadim Romashov from Tampere Peace Research Institute. I'm Susan Allen, hosting this particular version of Methods Mondays. Dr. Romashov is a postdoctoral researcher at Tampere Peace Research Institute, Faculty of Social Sciences at Tampere University in Finland. He works for the Academy of Finland project Diasporas and Conflict Transportation, Intergroup Dynamics, and Host Country Responses. In his doctoral dissertation, Vadim focuses on everyday practices and narratives of living together in Armenian-Azerbaijani rural communities in Georgia. His research interests include coexistence and difference within small communities, international peace building and community-led processes, nationalism, social invisibility, solidarities, tensions among migrant groups on their varied paths of integration. And he has taught courses on everyday peace, violence, and conflict at Tampere University and University of Helsinki. Vadim has been involved in several international research-based conflict transformation initiatives in the South Caucasus and in Moldova. He is an editor at Caucasus Edition, Journal of Conflict Transformation. And he is here today to speak with us on ethnographic peace research methods. And the title of his talk I had pulled up, there it is, Ethnographic Peace Research, Methodological Insights from the South Caucasus. Okay, without further ado, Vadim, I turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for inviting me to give this presentation to George Mason University. It's a great honor for me. And I slightly changed a bit the title of my presentation because, of course, I do not provide insights from the entire South Caucasus, but from this, from the context in which I did my ethnographic research for my doctoral dissertation. And it is about two Armenian-Azerbaijani villages in Georgia, in which I have conducted my research. Thank you for this extensive introduction. And yeah, I would continue with the presentation. I would maybe say a couple of words about ethnographic peace research as such. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this rather new conceptual and methodological field in peace research. It's not new in terms of like that the ethnographic methods have never been applied in our field, in the field of peace and conflict studies. But recently it becomes more systematized somehow. So it's already emerging on its own as a conceptual and methodological approach. It is very interdisciplinary and methodologically flexible in the sense that it uses different complementary methodologies in its practice of peace research. But in general, it follows this and even prompts the local turn in peace research. There are different, of course, interpretations of this turn. Some of them call it anthropological, cultural turn. So in this sense, it's actually quite natural or organic that peace research now is getting closer to social anthropology or bringing social anthropological approaches also in to its own field of research. And I would say that the most recent and important contributions were made in 2018 by Gerard Miller, who had a research project on ethnographic peace research, developing ethnographic peace research as a methodological approach in the field, and he, together with other colleagues, of course, worked on this project and published an edited volume called Ethnographic Peace Research in the special issue in the Journal of International Peacekeeping. But of course, I should say that definitely there were also other earlier important publications on the conceptual, methodological, and empirical relationship between uh, anthropological methods and peace research, of course. In its focus, well, the field, this methodological field focuses mostly on, by definition of ethnographic methods, it focuses on micro and meso levels of social relations, but of course there are interconnections with macro level dynamics, individual and collective experiences of violence and conflict, taking an important part of this methodological approach. And of course, the peace processes of different kinds, but especially those peace processes which are occurring in the everyday life of people, are in the focus of ethnographic peace research. And actually, it contributes to this, which is now probably you have heard about in the field of peace building practice. There are increasing calls to include locals in leading, designing peace building projects. So somehow by studying local peace building solutions, ethnographic peace research contributes to this call, to this turn for local agency of peace. And but of course, the question is what is local remains as a part of big debates in the field. But in general, by studying customary ordering, traditions, norms, practices, which are maintained by people in their everyday lives, somehow contributes to this local ownership, if it informs, of course, practice of peace building. And then everyday practices and concepts of peace are, of course, part of this direction as well. Social memory is very important as well, because when we study collectives, communities, it's important how they produce and maintain social memory, their collective memory of living together, as was in my case, or also the social memory of violence and traumas and other different experiences. Hierarchies, power, and contestation are usually not forgotten. So definitely it's not only about harmony and peace as such, but also about power and contestation, and how these are related to structural political dynamics, to the structure, to the system in general is very important. I don't want to, of course, to pitch somehow very much ethnographic peace research as a method to do peace research in general. Of course, there are different other methods in our field, in the field of peace and conflict studies, but definitely this methodological approach has its own analytical advantages, and that's how I become intrigued or became interested in this methodological approach, because it disregards in detail the social phenomena developed in relation to peace. Moreover, it allows us to study different pieces, multiple pieces. So there are not only, of course, peace as such, which is like universal peace. Peace has different variations in different contexts, and ethnographic peace research allows us to study these multiple pieces in different contexts. So it provides a contextualized understanding and explanation of peace, of conflict, violence in different contexts, and represent in more detail the research context, of course, itself. The main question usually is how and why certain phenomena or certain experiences emerge in relation to violence, conflict, or peace. And eventually it provides this quite rich and extensive fine-grained accounts for peace research, which are quite rare in the field still and very much focused on states and big power dynamics. So coming back to to my own research. So I don't know how much you are familiar with the Armenian-Azerbaijani relationships and the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict particularly, but at least maybe you have heard about that. I will not go into details about on the history of this conflict, but I just would like to say how I came to do this research. So for me, I realized that there is a certain puzzle that I encountered while working or researching Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict more from traditional foreign policy analysis, international relations approaches. This was my initial take on this conflict. But then I realized that I read a book actually. The book is called The Black Garden by Thomas de Waal, in which he described an interesting case of two villages, actually one village, Khojorny, in Georgia that he visited in 2011. And in this village, Armenians and Azerbaijanis are living together. And this village is very close to the Armenian-Georgian border, on the Georgian side of this border. And he provided a very even somehow rose-colored picture about the relationships between Armenians and Azerbaijanis in this village, which was quite an interesting case for me. Because of course, after studying this conflict more from the state-centered approach and analyzing official political documents, media discourses, I have learned about national antagonisms existing between two societies. And so when I heard about this case, about this village, I became very much intrigued by that. So I started wondering how Armenians and Azerbaijanis live together in Georgia, especially in these small communities, in these small villages in Georgia. And then I came up with several questions, research questions. And apparently, even though I used to do more like discourse analysis, content analysis in my previous research work, I realized that the best approach to study these questions could be ethnographic. So to provide you a general picture about these two villages in Georgia where Armenians and Azerbaijani live together, I would like to share some demographic statistics. So the Marneule municipality is the municipality where these two villages are located. And if you look at this demographic statistics, you can see that the Marneule municipality itself is rather Azerbaijani populated, mostly Azerbaijani populated. However, these two villages have a quite big ratio or proportion of Insopi of Armenians and Khojorny of Azerbaijanis, while the Tsopi is mostly Azerbaijani populated and Khojorny is mostly Armenian populated villages. And actually the ratio is quite similar, but reverse. And that also brought some like it was also interesting for me to study, to compare these two villages somehow. And these villages are located very close to each other. So if you look at this map, so this is the village of Hojorni, and this is the village of Tsopi. However, of course, there are also other villages, maybe with less, with smaller number of Armenians and Azerbaijanis in this kind of proportion than Tsopi and Hojorni, but still there are some villages, mixed villages where Armenians and Azerbaijanis live together. For example, Kirovka, then Shulaveri, which is a kind of agglomeration of several villages in this area, and then the village of Mirzoevka. Well, it's nowadays called differently in Georgian, but locals still refer to this village as Mirzoevka mostly. And Marnoulis, this is the capital of this region, of this municipality. So if, as you can see, there are several villages, and actually, even though I spend most of my research time in Tsopi, in Hojorni, I still visited all of these villages, and also Sadakhlo, which is an important village close to Tsopi and Hojorni, because this is the place where where is the crossing point between Georgia and Armenia on the border, and it used to be a village that harbored the biggest bazaar in the 90s and early 2000s in Georgia, but also in the entire South Caucasus. In this bazaar, both Armenians and Azerbaijanis used to trade with each other. Also, local Azerbaijanis, local Armenians, and then those Azerbaijanis coming from Azerbaijan. So this village has this social memory of these important bazaar relationships in the past, while the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan was happening just next door, basically, because this is the border between Azerbaijan and Armenia is now closed, and sometimes there are clashes on this border as well. So that's why I called my ethnography shuttle ethnography, for two main reasons. First of all, because my on-site research was divided into 3 periods. So I visited this region 3 times. So I had 3 research trips to the region between October 2016 and May 2018. But also, as I mentioned, I visited several villages in this region, mostly Tsopi and Hojorni, but also other villages. So I was on constant move between, first of all, Tsopi and Hojorni, of course, but also visiting other villages. So there was a kind of active mobility between and within several sites. That's why I call my approach like shuttle ethnography somehow. And I realized that there are several advantages of that. Of course, there are many disadvantages, of course, difficulties that you face since you are not spending all your time in one village, so you're not living there. I was living most of the time in Marnouli, and then taking almost every second day these kind of small mini buses to the village, to one or to another village. But this active mobility actually helped me a lot to understand cultural aspects of spaces, as well as spatial aspects of cultures in these villages and in the entire region as well, because also while you are on the move, spending time in these buses, you're also continuously doing observations. You are engaged in conversation with local people. So it's part of your research, of course, research on the move. But I also spent several days in some villages. So it's not only that I came there for a few hours and then left. Of course not. I was staying overnights there as well. Yeah. So, but also, as I mentioned, like I had these 3 research trips to the region. That also allowed me to observe change and evolution in the region. For example, uh, also some political changes in Armenia, as it happened at the time when I was there, as during my last visit in my last research trip to the region. There was a so-called revolution happened in Armenia, and when there was a considerable shift of power in Armenia, and that somehow affected also uh, very much the local Armenian population. So I managed to observe this. Then there were several elections. Elections in Georgia happened during this period, so it also helped me, to because I observed 2 election periods there, electoral periods. So it was on itself very insightful for me. And of course, there are several, like especially rural everyday life, it alters a lot based on the seasons throughout the year. And because I tried to visit this region in different seasons, and helped me also to see how this seasonal alterations of rural everyday life occurred. And it also allowed me to be there in different periods of time when there were some important commemoration events happening or celebrations of religious celebrations or commemorations of some important historical events for both Armenians and Azerbaijanis. And in addition, it was important that for me to take some breaks, because when you are spending a lot of time in one place, then you are focusing too much on the context in which you are placed at the moment, and you are also using those like your research is very much based on that preparatory work that you have done before going to the field or to the site of your research. So somehow you have no time much to reflect on the research data, on the research material that you have collected, because you are constantly collecting it. There is no break for you to stop. So because I had these small breaks between my research trips, it helped me a lot to reflect on my position as well as a researcher during the previous research trip. It helped me to collect additional secondary material. It helped me to study the research material that was collected during the previous research trip, and so prepare better for the next one. So it allowed me more for new discoveries, so-called, for in the next field trip. It's important, of course, to be self-reflexive on positionality, on your as a researcher. It's important to keep in mind that ethnographic methods have close ties with colonialism and imperialism. So it's important to reflect on your position in order not to create, not to reproduce this typical discriminatory dualism between us and them. So that's a big challenge, of course, because it's very hard to to be continuously reflexive on your identity. And since as you can guess, I'm being originally from Russia, even though based in Finland, working in Finland and doing my research in Finland. I visited this region with this kind of cultural background, with the imperialist, not only the past but also the present politics of Russia. So of course it affects certain my positionality in the region, and that created certain limitations of my research as well, on which I have to reflect a lot in order to not to reproduce this colonialist approaches of ethnography in my research. So my main limitations was language. Even though local people with whom I have interacted, they mostly spoke Russian language, not English, but Russian, and I do not speak Armenian or Azerbaijani or Georgian. At the same time, it helped me to have a certain distance from both Armenians and Azerbaijanis, because then, in the conflict affected environment, it's important to maintain certain distance from two groups in order to be able to access both groups. And then, of course, I have had a big limitation because of some customs, local customs. I was not being a male. I was not all. It was quite hard for me actually to access spaces in which women interact. For example, of course, I tried to do this from in different locations to interact with women and to collect also their perspectives on the situation, on the context. But at the same time, there was certain issue for me as well here. And of course, it's in the end important to understand that it's very hard it's impossible to attain absolute knowledge of the local context. So you will never become a local, of course. But by local, I mean like you will never be one from there, like being one like local one from here. So you will be always as a researcher from outside. I mean, you will remain an outsider. However, it's important, of course, to try to live the way as locals do. However, not to pretend much, because then you will break, because then your research become unethical and fake, basically, if you try to pretend as if you are local there. So I had two main and quite traditional approaches of ethnography in my research. So I relied first of all on observation, and of course, as I mentioned, observation is a never-ending process. You always do this observation. So it's, even though if you are not in this particular research context on which you are concentrating, but for example, you are living, as in my case, I was living in Marnauli. So, but I still was observing how because there were people like visiting from villages, visiting the capital of this municipality, because there was it's kind of business center of the region where people come to trade, to also to visit public houses for some administrative bureaucratic issues. So it was also important to observe how the interaction is happening there. So this is something which you cannot really stop. You're continuously observing while you are on the site of your research. But again, speaking about ethical issues, it's important to understand that there is this power dynamics here of observer and observed. And it's important to reflect on that and allow actually not to reproduce this power dynamics. So to kind of be open-minded, not to impose yourself much on people's everyday lives. So that's why I try to avoid kind of proactive involvement of local people in my research. Sometimes I even expected them to approach me, so I was present there. Of course, it's already an intervention in the local realities and the everyday lives of people, but I didn't really try to impose myself and with my research, but rather waiting that my presence will create certain interest among the local people, and they will approach me on their own, and then the conversation will start. So of course you will never be a complete participant of the everyday life of people. And I would not suggest to remain invisible observer, but on the contrary, in my case, I try to be very much visible, because I think it's also an ethical issue here as well. So you need to be visible. But observation is not only about people. You also observe some material environment, and which is built by the local people, but also some natural environment that also is building social relationships in this context. And eventually, I would say that my main position was, especially in these villages, that because of I regularly visited these villages, I became a known stranger to them. They knew me very well already, because like over 3 years I was coming there almost, for several period of time. I was there frequently, attending different ceremonies and rituals, and participating in some activities. So they knew me, but of course I was never part of this community as such. I was known stranger and a frequent guest that was accepted by the local people. There are several relevant contexts for observation that I identified for my research. One was, and probably the initial stage of my observation was working. So I just entered the village and start working around. And at some point, people start joining me somehow, like interacting with me, and then they either invited themselves me to, to make a small excursion in the village, or I asked them to show me some sites. So this walking together with locals, or also on my own, were a very important part of my important context of my observation in and around the villages. So it was mostly about like observing also the material environment, but also social interactions from certain distance. Another stage, or another relevant context for my observation, was participating in routine labor activities in different, so together with locals, of course, when we became friends, because it's also like as a, it's quite common that over a certain period of you become very close with some people, and you start participating in their everyday activities more. So I participated in some of routine labor activities, but I, of course do not say that I was working there as much as local people, but I somehow, sometimes provided some help when I gave a hand when I was invited, of course, to do that. So, but this was also very important for me to observe how mutual help, for example, was very much part of this intergroup relations, neighborly relations across um, some divides between the two groups. The same accounts to customer leisure activities. So I try to participate, and actually this is the period, this is the context in which a lot of conversation happens usually. For example, some gatherings in chaykhana, tea houses, local tea houses, or on village squares, where every evenings local males gather to discuss the issues of of the day, and different communal events, celebrations, especially religious celebrations, but also weddings. I mentioned already elections, different commemorations, and then homes and families where people invite you to have a lunch with them, to spend some time to participate in some parties, or watching TV together was sometimes very insightful for me as well. And schools as the most important institution which is operating there in these villages left from the Soviet time because of many other um, institution like institutes of the past and enterprises are now destroyed, but schools are operating, and they are now became a center that, like in each villages, schools are the central places uh, for communal relations and developing relations from the very childhood. So observation is one approach, one method that I relied most of the time, or continuously, or even always, because of, as I said, observation is always in use. But my second uh, approach within this ethnographic methodology was conversational engagement, which is also always at hand. You first observe, but then when you need to get involved more in like or increase your participation in communal activities, so then you need to, of course, start conversations with local to engage in some conversations to understand and learn the local context better, to explain your presence, why you are here, for what purposes, and simply to navigate and live on the site. And of course, try to still find the answer to your research question. But as I mentioned, for me, it was very much important that I was not very much active in this. So I was also passive somehow, waiting that people would approach me and try to engage themselves in their everyday life activities. I try to avoid formal methods of conversational engagement or conversations, so I did not really much rely on interview. I didn't use very much prepared questions, so there was, of course, I had always in mind something to ask and somehow to keep my research on track. But at some point I realized that formal settings of interview do not really work. People expect more informal conversations, some conversations that happen spontaneously, casually, because they are very much part of their routine lives and their everyday way of relating. And this also shows that you are more open and supportive person when you are more for informal conversations rather than trying. For example, if you ask for an interview, so then you would most likely be labeled as a journalist because this kind of typical false role that was assigned to me until I really presented myself as I am researcher. I'm not a journalist. So interview didn't really work in this, but informal conversation were very helpful. And in the end, of course, ethnography is not only about collecting, so-called collecting research material, it's also about writing. And this is the most powerful part of the research process. Because when you write, when you are writing about context in which you have visited as a visiting researcher somehow, you are not only describing the things, you're also creating. You're creating a lot of things because it's your own interpretation. It's never like nothing which is absolute truth in this sense. And that's why it's very important again to remain very self-reflexive And for my own writing, I try to be self-reflexive, and I use somehow story-based writing. So my writing was mostly like bringing stories that I have collected throughout my research, but also bringing in my own personal stories of myself there, how my research was organized and how I was interacting with local people. Well, and to conclude, so of course, I cannot go into all my findings because it was not really the purpose of this Methods Monday session. So focused mostly on methodological approaches, but some few findings. So of course, not of course, but I managed to identify certain national sentiments there that lead because of it's not that people living in these villages in Georgia somehow isolated from dominant nationalist narratives from Armenia or from Azerbaijan. They follow the news, they communicate with people from that societies as well. So this nationalist antagonism somehow present there. But people find certain ways how to distance from the conflict. They identify themselves different from people living in Armenia and Azerbaijan, so they are living on Georgian lands that also very much used for the purpose of distancing from the conflict. Then I have quite a in my research, in my special writing, I focused a lot on neighborly relations, how mutual help is organized, how everyday communication is happening, how people avoid speaking about the conflict, and how they share joy and sorrow, as they say. Eventually, I managed to come up with my own definition of everyday peace as part within communal contexts, and I identified four main elements of that: communal narrative, communal order, communal idea of peace, communal practices. And eventually, I realized that the main organizing principle for communal relationships is reliance on contradictory discourse on difference, which quite typical for many other contexts in our everyday lives, which means basically that we are all same and different at the same time. And I would like to conclude with this slide that I think explains a lot why we need ethnographic approaches in peace research, because if we are not very much engaging with the context of our research, if we are focusing, if we are conducting mostly desk research on the conflict affected, so-called conflict affected societies, we usually focus on the border between us and them. But what is important, and we actually see this border more than we see what is behind that border. And ethnography allows us to cross this border somehow, or maybe not even to cross, because we cannot really completely cross it, but we could blur this border somehow, so that you can see more what is behind this border than this distinction line between us and them. And I would like to stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vadim. I offer anyone who has a question to go ahead and raise your hand or stick a question in the chat. I already have a question myself, so I'll go ahead and start. So Vadim, you presented, really appreciate your emphasis on methods, because that's the focus here for this hour. And you presented a lot of the advantages of the ethnographic peace research method and the shuttle ethnography that you used. I wanted to ask you to briefly reflect on any of the disadvantages, because for all the advantages, I'm assuming there are also some disadvantages. If you could speak to that, please. Or anything you might do differently if you were to do a similar study again. Like what are some thoughts you have about not just disadvantages, but just kind of ways to further develop the methodology?
Yes, thank you, Susan. Yes, indeed, this is a very important question, and um, I would say that the main disadvantages, first of all, there are organizational, of course, issues here, because if you have, especially your research collection of your research material is spent over several years, then it's very, first of all, it prevents you to develop to start writing actually and analyzing um, the research material and even finalizing your dissertation on time, of course. But this is one aspect of that. So basically, you are living from one research trip to another research trip, and there are many different constraints for that, like organizational constraints, financial constraints, family constraints that would not allow you to spend like enough time. And there is never enough time. This is what at some point I had to realize, that I need to stop collecting the research material and focus already on analyzing it. Sometimes, yeah, it's enough, to. It would the best thing would be for me if I spend there the whole year. But as I mentioned, for different reasons, I could not. That would be quite luxury for me. So that's why I had to organize several research trips to that. Then another issue of trust. Sometimes that, of course, when you are there just for a small period of time, especially in the beginning, I spent only 1 month in the region, and coming and going there, people were probably keeping certain distance from me because they didn't really know what I'm for here. And only when I visited, and and it's also was a very important part of like how to create trustful relations. I was there. I said like I will come next year, and I did come back next year, and that already created okay. So this person keeps his words, and somehow that also contributed to trust. But of course, if you are like constantly going back and forth between the sites, that might, especially if it is done for a very short period of time, that people might be suspicious about your presence there.
I see in the chat, Raju has posted a question. Were there any safety issues or safety concerns you had? And I guess I would add to that a question of if you mentioned doing conversational engagement, and I wanted to ask, what's the first thing you say to someone? You've been waiting at the bus stop or waiting outside the place where people are having tea or something, and like, how do you begin your conversational engagement would be a question that I can think relates to sort of your sense of safety in the place where people know who you are and what you're doing. And another question would be, I don't know, in Finland, what the institutional review board that approves research, what were their requirements in terms of informed consent for the people you talked with? And you mentioned like doing the informal conversational engagement, which was more productive than a formal interview. And kind of the rigidity, from that region, I can imagine the rigidity of a formal interview would feel very odd for some of the potential people you would be talking with. So how did you do informed consent as you're doing this kind of more informal engagement? A bunch of related questions there.
Yes, thank you. And maybe we'll start from the last one. There was no requirement for ethical review for me, because in Finland it's usually if you are doing research with vulnerable people, then it requires to to obtain specific ethical review for that, or the review like provided by the ethics committee. But in my case, it was important, first of all, how like to have this informed consent. Of course, you cannot really ask this immediately from when you just enter in the village, you know, and you see a group of people and start conversing with them. So of course, it's you will not immediately ask everyone for informed consent, but as such. But this consent, I have obtained it by simply immediately presenting myself, who I am, who I am, and what I'm doing here. And if people refuse talking to me, then fine. Then I accept this as their desire until maybe next time when they see that I'm not, I don't create any threat to them, and then they would like to engage in talking to me. So for me, it was very much important to make myself visible that I'm researcher. I'm here for research purposes. I'm not journalist, because it's quite often was also a role assigned to me, as I mentioned, like that I'm a reporter, a journalist. Sometimes even I'm a spy, like as a part of joke. It was, you know, quite often told that, oh, you're spying here, and it's very common for ethnographers in different contexts, of course. So it was there, but then I had to continuously show that I'm not here for that or that reasons. I'm here for research. I'm doing research on how Armenians and Azerbaijanis live together in these villages, in these communities, and their cultures. And I think that was somehow enough for them to get me to know as well. And this also created secure environment for me, because people knew why I'm there, for what purposes. And because I was regularly there, they trusted me more with each time.
Thank you. Anyone else have questions for Vadim? Yes, please, Ibrahim.
Oh, hello. I'm Ibrahim. Greetings from Turkey. First of all, thank you for this great presentation. Actually, my question is related to Susan's one. I'm wondering, did you have any specific technique to delve into your specific research interests and asking questions about them? Or did you just wait for the exact, great moment before asking that questions? And did you try to make yourself more familiar with them before asking questions? Because you talked about, some common activities like, labor issues or some events, traditional. Did you wait first, make yourself familiar and then ask questions, or you first introduce yourself and I have these questions, I want to talk about that topics? I mean, what was your method?
I didn't, as I mentioned, I didn't have any like prepared structured interview grid or something like that. So like I really relied on very much on being present there in the explaining that for what purposes I'm there, and that already quite often helped to start the conversation on the issues related to the research. But of course, for me, it was also because I understood then when I present myself, when I'm telling what I'm for here, people start immediately reproducing very general discourse, the one that they usually provide to every outsider, because these villages are being visited by many journalists continuously, and it's nowadays actually even more than after the Second Karabakh War thing than before when I did my research. And because they are visited, people already, have a certain story which they want and discourses that they want to present to the outsider. And of course, I realized this, that it happened so to me as well. That's why I decided not really to start conversation about the Armenian-Azerbaijani relations in this village or Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict as such immediately. Through engaging that's why I'm calling this not even conversation but engaging. So through different activities, then you realize what kind of place the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, or between the Armenian and Azerbaijani societies occupy in these villages, when it is relevant for them, how they avoid it, how they when they speak about the conflict, when they speak about the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, in which context, in their own circles is one thing, and their communal public sphere is another story. So there are different contexts in which this issue appears, like the issue of conflict appears, but there are even more contexts in which this issue does not appear. And for me, this exactly was important to see why, in this particular context, how people avoid talking about the conflict, how they are focusing on their everyday issues, like working together, helping each other, sharing, inviting each other for lunch, for tea, to celebrate weddings or birthday parties or things like this. So this was for me even more important than to ask them direct question. So what about your Armenian-Azerbaijani relations here? This was not really on my table. However, of course, I try to explain why I'm here, why I'm there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think we have one final question very briefly, if you could, Raju.
I was going to ask you, yeah, thank you for the great presentation. Vadim, did you see people using social media and how did they express themselves? Was it a different stance than their private stance or their communal stance?
They do, of course, use social. I mean, like, do I follow their social media? For my research, I didn't do that much. However, I did follow it when there was particular celebrations or commemorations events, and especially in relation to schools, because schools environment, they are quite open there. So I was allowed to visit these schools, and teachers were very open and very much engaging, but there are also some organizational constraints for that, because to do research inside the schools, and like I had to obtain permission, from and I did that actually from the Ministry of Education and some point, but I was not I could not be present in schools continuously, constantly there. However, this context is very much interesting and very much important, because this is the place where friendship between Armenian and Azerbaijani, among them, are created, like from the very beginning, from the childhood. So, and because and there are different commemorations events which are happening in the villages. They're usually centered around schools, and they are different from year to year, of course. And I was not, I could not be there present every year, as I mentioned. So for me, it was important at least to follow social media of those teachers who published some information about these different events in schools, and to see how they are organized. However, to be honest, I didn't use that material much in my research, but I did follow it for the general interest as a participant observer.
Well, thank you. We're coming to the end of time, and I want to give you really sincere gratitude for making this presentation. I know a lot of folks will be watching the video recording later. And I think that, yeah, what you've given us is kind of the more of the detail that's behind. Sometimes we get the one paragraph description of a method, and you've given us a lot of the detail, which will help inform other people's methods that they choose in future research. I particularly appreciated your description of taking this approach, allowing us to shift away from an us-them focus and hard and fast lines, but to be able to blur the lines and engage in a meaningful way in an understanding that has the nuance and the contextual relevance. So very helpful. Thank you so much for your time, and hope everyone will join me in thanking Dr. Vadim Romashov. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you.
Thanks so much.